Welcome to our November Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Niki Roach, and this is a monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a MiniPod because it's only going to take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. So each MiniPod, I'm joined by an environmental expert, and we explore 3 issues that are making the headlines, keeping you right up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guest sees exciting possibilities. So today we're joined by a freelance environmental journalist and editor of the Environment magazine, a CIWEM publication, Jo Caird, and we'll be talking about using geoengineering to repair the climate, the unprecedented drought impacting Tehran in Iran, and the Tropical Forests Forever facility. So listeners might expect us to be talking about the climate conference in Belém that's kind of wrapping up, and we're going to pick that up a bit more in our deep dive episode in a couple of weeks' time. Let's start with geoengineering, Jo. What's piqued your interest?
So I was listening to the World at One last week, Radio 4 News, and heard about a policy briefing from the Royal Society about the risks and potential of solar radiation modification, essentially techniques to geoengineer the climate. They were talking specifically about this thing called stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, or marine cloud brightening, MCB, which essentially both involve putting small aerosol molecules, compounds, up into the atmosphere at different heights, depending on those 2 different technologies, in order to bounce back the rays of the sun to try and cool the climate. The reason that they did this policy briefing, I think, was to stress that actually this technology, while possible, is very risky and complicated and not an easy fix. It would require ongoing commitment to such a process, but that actually it is possible, and we see this in experimental settings. They have done work like this over the Great Barrier Reef in order to try and cool the waters to prevent coral bleaching, and it's worked a bit there. And also we've seen it naturally where you have volcanoes erupting and all sorts of stuff going up into the atmosphere, which then does create a cooling effect. But these aren't the only ways of controlling climate in this way. You can also refreeze the Arctic, is the kind of quite exciting term. I did a piece for BBC Wildlife magazine about work that's going on for the Centre for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge. Was just given quite a big wodge of public money, £9.9 million by a UK government body called the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And that's to do with pumping water onto Arctic ice to try and thicken that ice to prevent melting in the summertime. And all these technologies are exciting in a sense and promising in a sense, but obviously the primary thing we need to do as a globe is to stop emitting in order to stop this process. But it is a little bit encouraging that such technology is being looked into on the sense of feasibility studies. It's not just pie in the sky. So that's why I've picked this with the caveats of we must try and stop the emissions in the first place.
Did you pick up anything about unintended consequences or feedback loops? Because I guess for me, part of my nervousness is you start doing this and you can control it, but then is there a point at which you can't control it? What's the level of control they've got here? Is this climate or is this weather? I think is what I'm asking, Jo.
Something that the Royal Society definitely did point to was this idea of a termination effect, that if you stop this solar radiation modification while greenhouse concentrations are still high, you could then have a blip where global temperatures could increase by 1 or 2 degrees within a couple of decades because, I guess, of a kind of a bounce back situation. I don't know the science. It is definitely risky. And I think with all of these things that you can only test on a small scale. But if you're talking about these initiatives would need to be global, they would need to be massive. And I'm not entirely sure we are brilliant currently as a world at coming together on these things. But I thought it was fascinating thinking about what the broad scale application of some of these technologies could be.
I also think there's that risk that we're hoping technology will save us here. And you're absolutely right. Some of this is very much still in our control, isn't it? It'd be interesting to see what comes out of COP and where the world leaders land us. Well, a great one to start thinking about. And we'll pop a link to that policy brief in the show notes if listeners want to find out a little bit more. Okay, so let's move from geoengineering in that case then to our second story. And that takes us to Tehran. So I've been really interested to read in the news very recently that the main source of drinking water for residents of the Iranian capital is at risk of running dry dry within a matter of weeks, according to state media, due to what they're calling a fairly historic drought. I think they are in year 5 of this drought. And the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, has warned that if it doesn't rain by the end of autumn, then the city, which is around 10 million people, might need to be evacuated, which, I just thought that was extraordinary to hear that as a kind of concept, really. The reason behind it is, as you might expect, it's not rained for a very long time, but also that their infrastructure pretty old. Sounds fairly familiar to those of us working in the UK. Some of it's been quite badly damaged, I think, in the 12 days of conflict that happened with Israel earlier on in June this year. But also the country is extremely reliant on water for agriculture, partly as a result of sanctions. And so they have over abstracted, and sort of 60% of Tehran is fed by groundwater, and the groundwater levels are sort of through the floor. But also, and this is the really stark stuff, I think, there's 5 major dams that feed Tehran, and on average they are 11% full, and the La'ar reservoir is at 1%. Tehran sits at the foot of some very large mountains, and it typically has these really hot summers that I think we would expect, but then these quite wet autumns and snowy winters, and there is no significant rain forecast until the end of November at the latest. And obviously trying to find independent media sources coming out of Iran is something that I've been sort of looking at when researching this. Apart from waiting for rain, they're already doing rationing, so there's already cut-offs. They're also reducing the pressure down to almost nothing at night, which is to reduce people's usage and reduce the ambition for people to want to use water. But then interestingly, they had a couple of extra public holidays to try and encourage people to leave the city, just to reduce demand. And listening to somebody who now works for the UN but used to work in the Iranian government, he was talking about how they are likely to potentially go into like a government shutdown a couple of days a week, and then say to people, please take holiday and leave the city. When they talk about an evacuation in a slightly more planned way, but they've got a control over a level of the workforce to say you have to leave. What's interesting as well is it's also impacting power, because they use water for cooling. So you're also starting to see power outages happening. So no good news at the moment. I think really interesting that it's this combination of factors. And a couple of years ago, we talked on the pod about Uruguay, and similarly, they got down to, I think, 3% in the reservoir that fed Montevideo. And thankfully it rained, but it sort of drifted to this point, and then suddenly they're absolutely in crisis.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Rainfall patterns decreasing and leaky network. Presumably, have they got a kind of water resources plan? It'd be interesting to know. In this country, in the UK, of course, we've been talking a lot in CIWEM circles about water resources, long-term water resources planning, and transferring between wetter areas to drier areas and building new reservoirs. Of course, you went to visit Havant Thicket recently. Presumably, they'll have to do something similar. They'll need a similar series of measures over there, right? Because you can't just cross your fingers and give people more public holidays. That's not going to work, is it?
Not in the long term. I think it's a great question. It's quite difficult to get clear information, is what I would say. There are not lots of critics of the regime, but certainly where you do hear people challenging the situation, it is that there's been a lack of transparency. And so it's almost felt like this has sort of suddenly happened. So I would be interested, like you, to know, well, what's the long-term water resources plan? And interestingly, it's not just Iran. So Iraq, obviously right next door, is experiencing its driest year since 1993. So the Tigris and the Euphrates have seen levels drop by almost 30%. So there is a wider regional challenge, I think, but exacerbated by some Iran-specific factors. So I'm very keen to find out more. I think it's one to watch, certainly, as we move forward throughout November.
It just feels like we're covering kind of Saudi Arabia's long-term water plans in the current issue of the environment. This is an issue, drought or flooding or both, is something that every nation practically is going to be tackling. And obviously, specific geographical and political circumstances are going to affect decisions on the ground. But also, presumably there are learnings that can be spread across different jurisdictions. Presumably those are conversations that are going on at high levels to try and share this learning and awareness, because this is going to keep on happening, isn't it?
Conflict and changing patterns of where people will be able to live are all things that are driven by lack of access to water, aren't they? And whether that's driven by climate, whether it's driven by conflict, they're challenges that we're likely to see more of. So seeing that connected thinking around water feels if it wasn't important already, like increasingly important as we move into more uncertain times. Yeah, so one to watch, certainly. No good news, I'm afraid, but certainly interesting. Right, let's talk about our final topic. So tropical forests forever is something that Lord Goldsmith, who joined us for our October deep dive, talked about a little bit. I know he's been really working with the UK government to help develop this fund, but now as we're in the kind of COP period, tell me a little bit more about what you're reading about this forest fund, Jo.
It caught my attention because amid all the complexity and technocratic detail and policy making and wrangling of COP and bad news about what the petrostates are doing, that I write about the environment, I personally find it difficult to get to grips with some of the stuff that happens around COP every year. But I guess the Tropical Forests Forever facility, which is a title I really like just because it's got a certain like best friends forever feel to it, I don't know. It just feels a bit tangible, a bit more tangible. You know, the aim is to get £125 billion into kind of an investment fund. And so you're not asking nations to just give grant money. You're saying this is money that's going into a big fund and it's going to raise money, and then that's going to go to these 70-odd tropical forest countries. And the money is there for conserving and restoring those forests, and it's all about transparency, and it's all about letting those nations decide what's needed on the ground themselves. So you're not coming in as advanced nations and saying this is how you do it. You're letting the local expertise make decisions. And my personal area of hope around it is that the aim is to have 20% of that money going to indigenous peoples who are managing the forest. And I did an amazing interview with a person called Saipa, who lives in the Papua New Guinean rainforest, who's been working with a charity called Cool Earth that aims to help local communities protect their forests by essentially giving them money so that they don't need to take money from the loggers. Beautifully simple and really effective, it seems to be so far. They're saving lots of forest. But this chap I spoke to, it had taken him 3 hours hiking through the jungle to get to the bus stop, and then he had to stay overnight at the bus stop because the bus comes whenever the bus comes, and then take a 3-hour bus journey to the city to get to the charity's offices to speak to me. And in order to find out about the interview, he's kind of their representative in the community. To find out about the interview, he had to climb a little peak overlooking their territory, which is about the size of Greater London. He had to climb a little peak so he could get mobile service. And for me to attend this interview, I came into this office that you can see me in now and opened my laptop. And that I found so striking, that I'm a person who's very interested in tropical forests, but obviously don't know very much about them. But he really knows, he's living it. And so it makes much more sense to give him and his community the money. And they decide, well, actually, what we need is solar lighting. And that's going to be more effective for us to run our community and to be safe. And then we can live our lives and not take money from the loggers, etc., etc. So if this TFFF, or whatever they're calling it, enables more on the ground work like that, then it just seems like a little thread of positivity, a glimmer that we can grip in this difficult moment.
Yeah, Zach, when he spoke to us, was really positive about the UK's role in trying to develop the fund. Have you picked up much more about that as we've gone into COP?
Well, it seems, unfortunately, that the UK will not be paying into the fund, which is very disappointing, obviously. So they're aiming for 125 billion. I think they've got about 5 billion promised so far, which, I mean, it's only launched like now this week at COP. But I think that's money is coming from France and Indonesia and maybe Netherlands, some others, don't quote me on those. But it is really disappointing that the UK is not giving money to it. And I think Keir Starmer's spokesperson has said, or Downing Street spokesperson has said, that we are still very supportive of it. And our aim, instead of giving money ourselves, is to direct the private sector to be giving money to it. If that's the case, and I guess we have no reason to doubt that that's the case, wonderful. Personally, I find that very disappointing, that to not even show intent to say, well, fling a bit of cash in there just to show the private sector that we're serious about it, because I think it would show better climate leadership to put some money into that fund that they've been working hard to create.
I always talk about everything being connected, and I think tropical forests can feel, like you've just described, quite remote. But actually, the reason that they're being cleared, for example, is to provide goods and services for us here sitting in other countries. So actually, it's nowhere near as disconnected as we think it is. So yeah, I'm with you. It'll be interesting to see how it develops. It was great that Lord Goldsmith talked to us about it. It's brilliant that you've been following it, and I will be keen to see as COP closes and we move forward where it's landed, because it does feel like something really tangible and positive, and particularly if they stick to that commitment around keeping Indigenous voices very much, front and centre in the fund, then hopefully it can only do good things. Brilliant. Jo, thank you. That is unfortunately all we've got time for, but you've given me loads to think about, and I'm sure our audience too. We'll pop a link in the show notes for all the stories that we've discussed, and I'll also link the Lord Goldsmith interview if you want to listen back to that. Thank you for joining us on the MiniPod. You can subscribe to Planet Possible wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode, and we've got more fantastic guests and topics coming up. And if you haven't caught it yet, our November deep dive is all about capturing heat from sewers to warm our homes, so definitely one to listen to. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guest, Jo Caird. So thanks for joining us, Jo.
Thanks for having me.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.